So these actually do go on to a YouTube channel, which is really neat. So you can go back and, look at your shirt, your hair, whatever, and decide whether or not that's something you want to wear again or, but they do actually go to a YouTube. So anyway, as Jared said, we met earlier this morning. We do have a PowerPoint to kind of pull you all through today to kind of facilitate some conversation. We do not at this point have any public feedback. Most meetings are waiting until next week, but the schedule for, I think there are 3 or 4 that have chosen to meet this week. So know that although, we don't have that public feedback to go through today, Jared will pull you through some of the things that we can brainstorm today. We may end up with some recommendations, we may not. That's all right. However, you will have that for your December 6th meeting. That's the next meeting will be December 6th. So just know that on the front end, you will definitely have it. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And you know how this works. Somebody's going to have to give me a thumbs up when you can see my screen. Okay, great. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying we see it now. I freaked her out a little bit this morning when she was testing that out, and I was like, yeah, I see. What's that in your Amazon shopping cart there, Jamie? And that she didn't think it was funny as I did. But
he said hair curlers. I said, no, that's your cart.
And they, that's a lie.
So, of course, at the launch of every meeting, it will be my responsibility to read through the statement just to kind of situate us back into the mode for really coming together to think about the new future funding formula. So I'm going to read through these. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. All righty. So at this point, Jared, I will work the slide deck and you go ahead and take over.
Absolutely. So again, this is going to be a very short meeting. Now, one thing, 2 things I'd like to accomplish today. One is we're supposed to elect a vice chair. Now, if someone would like to volunteer to take that on, obviously a very thankless task, but if you are willing to take one for the team and fall on the sword in this meeting, I am happy for us to vote on that and run with it. If no one is willing to take on that thankless task, because I feel like this question, if I ask it to the full group, is going to be the same response. Somebody's going to end up nominating somebody anyway before we get a name. So with that in mind, if someone just wants to go ahead and jump in and say, yeah, I'm willing to do that, that would be great. But if no one is, so let me ask, is anybody willing to do that of this group?
If nobody's willing, I want to nominate Pat.
Oh, yeah.
I nominate Ralph Schultz.
See, I was going to say who's the first person to get off of unmute themselves to get that going. So I think that's great. I think that's a great nomination, Ralph. So I will second that motion. And anyone else? All right. All those in favor, give a thumbs up. All right. Those opposed by like sign. All right, it passes. Pat, that's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, that way, hey, I think that's great because we got Chamber and Tennessee Business Roundtable represented on this on these meetings. So I think that's perfect. That's perfect.
All right.
So I want to ask a question. Oh, let's do roll call attendance. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm so excited about my question, Jamie. So do you have a list you want to call from, Jamie, or do you want to look at who's on the video? What's easiest for you? What's official?
So the way I've just been doing it is I'm just looking through the participant list here, and what will happen in the future if we ever have anybody just call in that's not, you know, in on, they don't have their video on or something like that, I'll just say, hey, whose number, phone number, blah, 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 blah. But that's kind of how I'm collecting. So right now I have Jared, Vicky, Ralph, Hope, Pat, and Laura. Sorry, Laura. So anybody else on here that I don't see anybody. I don't see any phone numbers. All right. I will keep an eyeball as the meeting progresses to see if there's anybody else that hops on.
So what you're saying is we're not your only subcommittee?
There are 4.
4? So which one's your favorite?
Well, I think that's up for debate. You want to battle it out?
Which one's the most fun, Jamie?
Well, I don't think that's up for debate.
Okay. Well, all right. So we've done the roll call discussions for me. Anything from meeting 1, we got a PowerPoint with an overview of what the current BEP formula, how all the math behind that, and then also some overarching information that helps inform that current BEP formula, some information on the process of this committee and not only what our roles are as subcommittees, but also what our deliverables are at the end of January. So we know those top level information. So anything based on that information we were given in that first meeting that you have questions about or need clarification on? Good. All right. All right. Are there any resources that you feel like that we might need beyond the feedback, the stakeholder feedback that is being collected from the state and that is being coded by the paralegal that will be sent to our subcommittee for us to reflect on, to discuss as a committee, and then also I'm sure there'll be quite a bit of time we'll need to spend individually because there'll be a lot of information. And then as we come back and meeting as a subcommittee, is there any other resources beyond that stakeholder feedback that we were presented with, those different conduits that you would like to see above and beyond that?
Jared, I think we also have a slide that might kind of help pull through that as well.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yep. So the must-have resources should have, nice to have, long shot. I've got one personally I'd like to put before the committee, and I'll say this has been something, a number I've been interested for a few years, but definitely more recently. And then as these conversations have arisen since the governor's call to action around this conversation, and then also some conversations we as a chamber have convened across the Southeast, this has been of particular interest to a lot of stakeholders. This in education, so practitioners within the K-12 space, post-secondary, parents and other stakeholders that aren't familiar with BEP. So we hear a lot about BEP being fully funded. And for the novice that has no idea about BEP whatsoever, and they hear that BEP is not fully funded, well, they ask, well, what does that mean? What does fully funded mean? And I know there's some litigation that's with some districts in the state about fully funding BEP. And so to me, a question I have had, and that since these conversations statewide have been going on, what is that number currently? So beyond any new formula, if we were just adhering to the current formula, what dollar amount would it take to fund the current formula the way it is calculated annually? So that if nothing changed this time next year and we were going to fund BEP formula based on the current calculations, what additional money would be required from the state of Tennessee to fund it fully? So for an example, for those that aren't familiar, if you look at instructional materials, and I'm speaking loosely for what happens in the classroom, so instructional costs, the BEP is funded at about 70% per what it would take based on the numbers calculated to fund it fully. About 70% of that number is funded. And outside the school building, for things like transportation and some things like that, it's funded around 50% as to what it's calculated to be funded fully. So that means at the local level, whether that's county money or county and city money that has to fill that gap, how much would it take to fill that gap statewide so that there's no local match? This isn't saying there shouldn't be a local investment. We're just, for argument's sake, what would that number be if there's no local money to fund BEP at 100%? What would that be? And I think, to me, that's an important number, because how do we make informed decisions about a future calculation if we don't even know what the current calculation would be? So, or at least I'm interested in that, and a lot of people that I talk to are interested in that. What would it take to fund BEP to 100%? So I'm sorry that was a belabored way to put that to the committee, but I'm also cognizant of people will be downloading this and looking at this who aren't in this committee. But that's my question. I feel like would be an interesting and important resource. Anybody else on the committee have thoughts on that?
Jared, I think this might be relevant, but I'm not completely sure. As I'm reaching out to the community to ask them their feelings about a new structure that is student oriented as compared to resource oriented, I find an awful lot of the time people are asking the question, what does a fully funded school district look like? That is, what is the number that achieves the kind of student excellence that we're looking for on a statewide basis? A lot of times that conversation isn't just about the state portion, it is also about the complete funding portion. That is, and look, I will just tell you that people have a tendency to gravitate toward, if private schools are doing a great job and achieving a high level of performance, people have a tendency to say that the expenditure in public schools should be equal to the expenditure in private schools, which I know is not, not necessarily a part of this state conversation. But I would tell you in summary that, people often say, what would full funding of a school system to achieve X be? And then what portion of that should be an expectation of the state, realizing that that's more of a resource-based conversation than it is a student-based conversation. But then they tend to say, okay, well, if it costs $25,000 to do a great education for a student, and we work backwards toward a student-based funding formula, that's, the conversation gets very convoluted at that point. So I just wanted to bring into the conversation that as I reach out to people on an individual basis, they're almost always starting from how much funding is needed to provide an excellent education. And then how does that correlate to an individual student? Just bringing that to your awareness.
Yeah, that's a great additional perspective, Ralph.
So I just don't know how that pertains to what additional information we might need. But I would tell you that there's a lot of conversation in that category.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think what my constituency from the Tennessee Rural Education Association would say, or at least the board members who are on my board that I'm chair of would say, is that how do we get at a number that adequately funds what would be a quality education for all students if we're obviously apparently we're not doing that now, or there would be no need for this conversation. So if we're not doing that now, what would it take to even get that current calculation to hold? What would it take to get it 100%? Are we talking $100 million? Because I've heard $100 million annually. I've heard $400 million annually. I think that's the problem, is that it's you hear so many different things that people are unsure of where we're even beginning. And so if it's going to be something that is so outside the realm of doing without a major tax increase somewhere, whether it's locally or statewide or where it might be, or an addition, an influx of funding, or a moving of funding from one pot in the state to another pot. If it's something that's out of the realm of possibility, like that's where people want to know, like, what are we talking? Are we talking about realistic, like something realistically we can do, or is this completely out of the norm? We need to figure out what is realistic based within those parameters. Again, I'm coming, a lot of that is coming from the rural and small districts that I'm speaking on the behalf of, just based on a lot of conversations and on my boards, what my board hears. I get what you're saying like that. I guess at the end of the day, that's what we need to figure out and work back from, but also just for people to wrap their heads around. People would like to know what that number is. Like, do we even know can we calculate that number, what it would take annually to get it 100%? Because that's what a bunch, I can tell you right now, if nothing came out of this process, I know a ton of superintendents that if you said we're going to fund BEP fully, they would be like, oh my gosh, that's what would serve my students. That's what would really help my district if it was funded 100%. So, yeah, I get what you're saying, 1,000,000% as well. Laura, what do you think?
So I think everything that you're saying is correct in that, you know, as a committee member, I think it's sometimes overwhelming and daunting maybe because we don't know where we're starting from. And so, you know, it's that whole thing of realistic, what's it going to take? The same thing that you were talking about, Jared. I mean, you know, I'm hearing the same thing from people up in our region as well as, you know, what is fully funded? How much money are we talking? What exactly does that look like? And I think that's where it's kind of overwhelming for us as well, is, you know, supposedly we're starting from the beginning. You know, realistically, how much money are we talking? If we don't have a starting point and don't know what that looks like, I think it's going to kind of be hard for us to kind of work through everything to say, yes, this could be possible if we're looking at, you know, XYZ or whatever. So I just think it's daunting and kind of overwhelming at times when we don't know exactly. I mean, we can all come up with figures. We could all say, you know, I think it's going to take X, Y, and Z to function every year, but realistically, is that going to be possible?
Let me just also add that, Pat, sorry.
I think you should go, Ralph, because I've got a different direction I want to, there's something else I want to voice here.
Okay, I'll just add this. I haven't talked to a single person that doesn't think that schools need more funding. There are some that wonder how the funding's being spent, but they all believe that there needs to be more funding. What they don't know is how much more funding from the variety of sources. And the other thing I would just like to reflect for the group is that they also understand that the issue isn't just inside the school. And so there is a question of, you know, that comes especially in this metro area with, for those that need wraparound services, how do you fund those wraparound services? I have to tell you that I'm trying to follow the rules of the subcommittee in the sense that we're reviewing feedback that is being submitted. I keep telling people, send your comments in, write them down and send them in so that they can be adequately reviewed by all of the subcommittees if it's relevant and important to those subcommittees. But I do want to say that, you know, that the one thing I hear consistently is nobody thinks that the funding is adequate anywhere at this point to get the kind of quality education. And I ask people, are they willing to pay? And they say, well, yes, but what does that mean?
Yeah.
So my 2 cents, I don't have a 2 cents on or anything to add on the question of how much is the right amount overall, or even, you know, take typical school district X, you know, what does that mean to be fully funded, and, you know, what does it take to get it done? I agree that those are important things. What I've been wanting to respond to is something that was a couple slides previous to this one on the deck we've got for today, which was if you can roll back a page or two, maybe. Yeah, that's not it. Yeah, or resource needs. Yeah, maybe we fast forward a little bit. If the question is, what does this subcommittee feel it needs in terms of what information do we need in order to do our work? And this is a good slide. If this slide is kind of our solve, the thing we've got to solve for, if you will, or what we're being asked to do in addition to reviewing the information that comes to this subcommittee, which is submitted by others, this one looks like homework that this subcommittee ought to be doing on its own. Please list specific resources you'd like to see incorporated into the funding formula, meaning take categories of expenditure in public education and classify them as to must have, should have, nice to have, and long shot. Do others see what I'm seeing? That's one of the basic, deliverables.
Yeah.
And if so, what I was going to suggest is a resource that I think this subcommittee might find really useful is some sort of a list of those resource categories. Sort of like a chart of accounts, if you will, for public education. I don't know how. I would imagine that the types of things you can spend dollars on, might be in the most granular form. There could be many hundreds of them. What I was going to ask for is, can we receive some information which says it's sort of like an outline, if you will, or a sort of cascading in level of detail. What do the current categories look like? Meaning, as an example, are there like 20 or 25 or 50 categories of things that you can spend on that we could maybe start trying to sift into must-haves, should-haves, nice-to-haves, or long shots? And I was going to suggest that might be an objective or rational way for us to go about doing some of this. I don't have anything to work from, and I'm not a policy expert on the BEP, certainly, and hardly on education more broadly. But what I would find useful is being able to review some information saying there are currently 16 categories and 64 subcategories of funding, and that would give me an idea of maybe trying to take the 64 and sort them into must, should, nice, and long shots, etc. Because I can come up with my own, thoughts about certain things, like what about, career counseling? Where does that fit in? Or certain elements of CTE instruction would be another thing. I'd kind of be curious to what are the, looking for a way to sort of take all of those into account. As I think about, and as this subcommittee thinks about trying to solve for X here, which is, I think is what's being depicted on this slide is this is the problem, solve for X.
Pat, I think that's a really good deduction, particularly when you're thinking about, as a subcommittee, kind of you're solving for X. I think that's a really great way of thinking about it, and with your permission, would like to use that with other subcommittees, because I do think that's kind of definitely what you're charged with, and then to put them into those buckets. But along with that, also trying to think about, are there things that aren't necessarily on that chart that you feel like as a subcommittee is really important and should be part of the funding formula? So it's the what's here and then what could be. So it's the future thinking of what could be.
Yeah, I would agree that, we should, that's part of our duty also, is to, see, okay, well, what's missing? And that might, help us. That's where I think was it where Ralph was saying, the private schools seem to be well funded. How do they, how do they sort out things? How do they fund certain things at a certain level? But, right now I feel a need as somebody who's charged with helping to figure this out, I need a little bit of information about, what is the current, not necessarily the formula itself, how do you apply certain numbers to it, just the categorization part, give me a structure within which to work. And then we can kind of determine what's missing, and we can start making some judgments as a subcommittee about, as chambers of commerce and industry representatives, what do we think should be in the must-have categories and the shoulds, et cetera, recognizing that there are 17 other subcommittees that will come up with different answers and put some things in nice to have that we think are going to have to be in must. And that's what I'm thinking that the steering committee is looking for from the subcommittees is, kind of weighing and comparing those sort of the rankings, if you will, in terms of importance that they're going to be receiving from the 18 subcommittees. At least that's my sense of what they will be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Pat, on the categorizing, because that was what I was trying to get at. I mean, that, for example, if we were people that tune in that might have zero understanding of BEP other than it's how much, let's say a parent, how much is spent on their child every year for their education. There's categories, and I alluded a little bit to it at the beginning, but if you just look at instructional salaries, the state funds about 70% of that part of the calculation of what 100% would be, but they fund 70%, or the state funds 70% of that. Of instructional benefits, which covers like retirement contributions, insurance premiums, for positions in those instructional salaries, the state funds about 70% of that as well. When you look at classroom costs, which it's everything from funding textbooks to at-risk students to equipment, nurses, instructional assistants, technology, that's about 75%. And then those non-classroom costs or outside the school, it's about 50%. So if somebody is looking at that and they're like, well, okay, we've got a calculation on what it should be, what is currently being said should be funded per pupil, but these other percentages are being funded 70, 50, 75. What would it look like to get to 100? Just let's start there, because again, I'm just speaking from personally, and a lot of my constituency would like to know, and from at least the business folks I talk to are like, they don't understand. You're telling me our educators are being asked to do this and saying, well, here's what money it would take to do this, but yet you're really being given 70% of that calculation. Why is that? Number one might be the question, but forget the why. What would that number be? What would 100% be? Like, what's the difference right now just to get to what 100% would be? Where are we starting from? And just for context, if nothing else, and maybe this is just a Jared Thomas Bigham Esquire question of the whole state of Tennessee, maybe it's just my curiosity. I would love to know what it would cost tomorrow to fund BEP, all those categories at 100%, just for a starting place. And I agree with you, Ralph, 100%. I agree with you, Ralph, when you said, well, we need to know what, maybe not even necessarily what that number is, but what is best for our students. Like, let's start there. And I get that, but I can tell you a lot of people would be over the moon with having BEP funded 100%. If nothing else, we went through the legislature and Everything else, if I know 50 rural superintendents, if this time next year the BEP was funded 100%, they'd be doing fireball shots down on Broad, where their preacher might not see them, but they'd be doing it. So that's why I keep pushing this question a little bit. I know it's not as simple as that for the outcome we're looking for, but I can promise you for some of the beginning conversations, for a lot of people, that it is that simple. So I'm going to quit. Hope, Lord of mercy, jump in here and bring some sandy from my part, because I know Ralph, Pat, and Laura being insane. I'm the one that's being insane. So bring.
With the 100% BEP, I know for here a lot of conversations, especially, from teachers and different ones and just the community, you hear, oh, teachers are getting a pay raise. But then the way the funding is set up, some of the teachers are funded through BEP, but then some are not. So then there's that discrepancy there with percentages and all of that, and just I guess a communication shortfall. I don't really know how to say it, but there's just always, that's a conversation too that gets brought up. I know.
And I think kind of what we're being asked here, to try to marry these two ideas together a little bit is, okay, teachers. Well, yeah, I think what this slide and what we're being asked to do at the subcommittee level is say, well, which teachers are the must have, which are the should have, which are the nice to have. And I think a lot of what, and this is actually the opposite of what it sounds like. I don't mean to sound like I'm discounting it. I'm saying that the questions that I think Jared and Ralph have raised are things that the steering committee and the governor and the legislature are going to ultimately consider, as they should. And I think we should also provide input on those questions. But in kind of going back to the solve for X bottom up approach is kind of how we're being asked to approach this, by first starting with the sort of blank sheet of paper, almost blank sheet of paper. I'm asking to start from not a blank sheet of paper, kind of just somebody give me some categories of what the expenditures are, and then so we can start to with what each of us as subcommittee members bring, and also the information that we're going to be receiving that's classified and sent to our subcommittee for review. We can begin to put together a sense of, starting to slot those things into must, should, nice, and long shot. And I would think that at the steering committee level and at the policy level, they would begin then to start saying, well, in a new formula, the must-haves will be funded at 100%, the should-haves at 85, the nice-to-have at 70, and the long shot something else. I'm just making that up, but I'm trying to imagine or envision, how that, how what we can do at this sort of the root level process here can feed up rationally into what the policymakers will be needing in terms of information, and to inform their ultimate decisions about how much.
Yeah, I think I'm going to kind of vehemently agree, I think, with what you're saying. But when I think from the,
add me in there too, Ralph, so we'll cover.
When I think about just something like transportation from a student perspective, what I'm going to be curious to see is how do you deal with the variables around transportation from a student perspective when maybe in Pulaski or somewhere, some rural setting, there are distances to cover that may not exist in other places. And then there are, in other circumstances, transportation issues that are variable, kind of by location or by district or whatever. But thinking from a student perspective, how do you calculate the cost of providing that transportation on a per student basis, and then meeting that need? And then again, coming back, Pat, to what you're saying, the must have, should have, nice to have, long shot, how does that variable figure into the need in that particular area on a student by student basis? So
yeah,
I like the structure that's developing here. And Jamie, as I'm thinking about this from a resourcing perspective, how much of that do we really need to know? Or how much of that do we really, do we need to know what a transportation variable looks like?
Well, or put another way, is there another subcommittee that's basically transportation based that is looking at that exact issue? And is that outside our scope as a chamber and industry subcommittee?
Right. Got it. Okay, I'm going to shut up.
No, don't do that.
No, don't at all. So I think this slide might help a little bit, particularly when you're thinking about.
I'm trying to get us to where, past boiling the ocean down to like, what is our part of the ocean that we need to boil?
No, I think that's great. So, when you're thinking about all these different subcommittees, they are designed by default exactly to get the results that we're looking for, right? So the idea is you bring your lens of expertise to the table. So to your point, are there committees that are digesting X together? So tell me if this is your question. And that means that's not, X is something that this committee doesn't need to really digest as much. Is that where you're going with that? Does that sound right? Right, you're on mute.
It does
Yeah,
sound right to me.
Yeah, I'm just seeking to, in all the stuff that we've been talking about is very consequential and has to be considered. And I'm trying to figure out what's our piece of it at this level and at this time. Not saying that this subcommittee or any of us can't have an opinion on what's the overall number, et cetera. But, first things first is kind of what I'm thinking, let's, try to define that piece that is our particular deliverable for this subcommittee.
Right. And in a limited amount of time, you want to prioritize what it is that you really work through together. So I'll definitely shoot that up the flagpole.
What are you shooting up there, Jamie?
Just to see if there is a better way for committees to kind of course, as you see on this slide, looking for kind of that level of expertise. What is it that you actually bring to the table based on your background? Why are you a group of folks from chambers and what do you all bring to this conversation that maybe the teacher advisory group doesn't bring? So is there a way for us to kind of flesh that out just a little bit more, so that you, I think, Pat, one of the things I hear you kind of maybe thinking through is there a more defined target, so to speak?
Well, I'll just mention as an example, everything we have to bring as a chamber serving a constituency of employers, we're going to write down and send in, okay? But when you task us as a subcommittee member, that I'll be bringing that perspective to the table, but I'm going to be operating there within guardrails, okay? The guardrails of this subcommittee. So to some extent, I am looking for the direction from you guys to tell us what's inside our guardrails as a subcommittee, okay? The rest of it, we're going to write it down, send it in, let you sort through it, let you send it to the right subcommittees. And I don't feel obligated necessarily to bring all that to the table. Pat, you're on mute.
I said, I just tried sharing a screen and it says that my screen is being shared. Is everybody seeing this, my cursor go up and down here?
See it, buddy. I
Yep.
see it.
These are the 18 subcommittees and ours is which one? Chambers of Commerce and Industry. So we're fourth from the bottom and these are the other subcommittees, if you will. It looks like they're, the subcommittees have been grouped on a by classification of who the participants are rather than what's the subject matter, which I find interesting. You know, we've got students with disabilities is the second one, English learners, economically disadvantaged. There's a teacher advisory, principal advisory, school systems, leadership and personnel, small and rural, suburban, urban, etc. So I think we need to kind of keep that in mind when we're trying to figure out what's the, you know, kind of what's the X that this particular subcommittee needs to solve for. How do I get rid of this?
I'll
Stop sharing.
I mean,
There we go.
personally, I've just been viewing it as the through an employer lens, like what's important to an employer is the way I've been approaching it. Now, I'm obviously open,
Yep.
whatever, but that's the way I've been approaching it. Not even chambers of commerce, more individually. If I'm an employer in the community, rural, urban, suburban, what does all this mean to me? Okay, they're going to reevaluate the student funding formula. I didn't even know there was a formula. Okay, then if I can get a better workforce from this process, I'm happy to give input on this and what I think would be important. That's the way personally I've been, almost individually versus holistically.
Yep, and the way I've been, to tack onto that a little, Jared, is the way I've started thinking about it is asking myself with a view toward, you know, kind of defining this better so that I can then go out to, you know, my own constituency, if you will, saying, you know, what are the parts of education that are most important from an employer perspective? And what are all those different things? I mentioned a few of them a few minutes ago, things like career advising and CTE instruction, you know, just two that are just, you know, obvious, but what else is there? And, you know, can we sort of come up with, as a subcommittee, can we come up with sort of an inventory of those pieces, parts of education funding that, you know, contribute most directly to, you know, our future development of our future workforce, which is the, you know, the focus of this particular subcommittee. We're looking at it through the lens of what, you know, what are the expenditures that are most needed in order to produce a college and career ready graduate, if you will, and focus on those. Maybe not try to figure out the retirement funding for the teachers piece, yeah, because that's somebody's area of expertise, and it's certainly relevant to ours. But at base, you know, we're probably the group that can speak with maybe the most authority on the most employer and, you know, college and career ready graduate related pieces of that puzzle. I don't think it's incumbent on us to figure out the entire puzzle or even have an opinion on every single one of those things. Because if I think to do, I you know, we'll be here past Christmas, and well, we're going to be here past Christmas anyway, but we're going to go crazy in a short amount of time. So, you know, really, I think today and next meeting, we, you know, focus hard on how do we kind of put some guardrails around it, you know, to use, you know, Jared's thinking, how do we kind of make that box smaller, you know, that we're trying to focus inside of.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. A great approach. I also believe that once you have that public feedback in your inbox and you have an opportunity to really dig through that, it will guide an awful lot of the conversation as well, because it will be culled specifically for this group. So
Plus, Jamie is saying, please God, give them something to respond to instead of this freewheeling meeting we had today that was supposed to end 55 minutes ago.
it's wonderful.
I think it'll be really interesting once we do start receiving some of that raw data to review. We might look at some of this and say, why in the world is our subcommittee getting this? This doesn't, you know, this doesn't match our mental framework of what we're supposed to focus on. And, you know, maybe that'll be an opportunity for us to, you know, kind of go back up the ladder and clarify, or maybe it won't. You know, maybe we'll just, you know, get the comments where somebody says, you know, I filled out a form, I'm, you know, business owner X, and I think, you know, kids ought to be able to do X, Y, and Z by the time they leave high school, and, you know, thank you very much. And that's kind of what I'm expecting we'll get, but I don't know. I don't know what this looks like. We're all cooking from scratch here, it seems.
So I have a question, and maybe a silly question. When I sit here and I think about, the feedback we hear from employers, a lot of it is critical thinking skills. It is, I guess the quote unquote soft skills, different things like that. Eye contact, being able to, show up on time, different things. But when I think about a lot of that, and I think of different schools, you visit or you hear about things going on, especially, STEM, just lots of different mindsets and things like that. So we're going into funding, but then we're also, when I think about that would be, it's almost, I heard the term the other day from a principal, is like breaking the school system or breaking down something. I can't remember how I exactly wrote it, or said it, but we're thinking about funding, which is dollars, what we're going to put into it. But then that takes it a next step, because, well, what if what we're doing on this level, as far as testing or however what we're doing, isn't working to what, for us specifically, for what our workforce needs are, for what our employers are looking for. So I guess I'm saying next steps after. So it's like, okay, this is what we want, but then they're going to put into a formula to calculate. But some of it's not a number. It would be a program reform. Does that make sense? Or am I thinking too much into that?
No, I think that's where Pat and Ralph's idea of let's be able to get some categories to understand where that would even fall helps answer some of those questions, to know like those soft skills we know that are a huge thing. We're hearing from employers as workforce development organizations. What's that even fall under? That, I think, so
Right. I think our first task is just to capture that and then do what we can rationally in terms of interpreting that, but the interpretation might not even get done until our work product as a subcommittee goes up to the next level. It might be at that level that they say, well, this subcommittee is telling us that this is important. How does that actually translate into an education expenditure? That might be, and that'll probably be something that many of us will definitely have an opinion on. But for this stage in the process, I'm kind of encouraging us to kind of, it's a flip around from the way I usually think of strategic planning. Everybody wants to dive into the details right away. This I view as more bottom up, where we're going to collect and synthesize to the extent that we can rationally into categories and assigning values of more, less, or none, or whatever. I think that's our charge at this stage, recognizing there are going to be other stages and hoping that we'll have an opportunity, and knowing that each of our organizations will have opportunity to offer input, once it get to the sifting and the translating stage too.
Could I just add one last comment? Talking to business people, I think what they want from education is pretty top of mind for them. They want those critical skills. They want the reading capability, the math capability, et cetera. What's not top of mind for them is how is it delivered or how is it created, because they're aware in some cases of the challenges that face teachers in the classroom, schools, in general, the issues that students face potentially as challenges. They don't really have a clue how all those things that have to be resolved. So I think the easy part for me is going to be able to say, this is what they're looking for, but the how it's delivered and then how that is funded on a per student basis is the part that they're pretty unclear on.
Yeah, that's the black box part. Everybody can kind of see, what's the output, and we want goes in the other part of the black box, but then in that black box someplace is where all the formalizing takes place. And that's the part that, lay people, if you will, or people who aren't steeped in education policy, just, who has time to figure all that out?
So you do have 2 meetings coming up that actually do revolve around costing. So that will be part of the materials that you'll receive, and the guiding questions and prompts you'll receive will help you as a team really dig into what does that costing look like? What do you already know? What do you need to know? So definitely know that's coming up. So I'm gonna, since we're about 5 minutes over, gonna ask if there are any final thoughts before we wrap today, or any final recommendations that you have. I'm gonna read you off a couple of the snippets that I've pulled. They don't at this time feel like what I would consider formal recommendations. I feel like they might formalize during the next meeting, but please do feel free to correct me if you feel differently. This is not necessarily a recommendation for the funding formula, but just to at least think about what additional money would be required to reach fully funded. What is the number to provide excellent support for each student? Does that sound like a question that was posed by the team?
Yes,
Okay.
I would ratchet it up from, that makes it sound like to the department it's amusing, and I'm very adamant about personally and my constituent. If it was just me, again, what world Jared know, but I can rattle off many of my constituent, and I would be doing them a disservice if I did not vocalize that.
So are there changes to that you would propose to that?
I wanted to make sure that it's not presented on to the next layer as amusing as something that's important to answer to help inform thinking moving forward.
All right. Second thing I captured was the need for a list of resource categories. I did add in, I think for a little bit of context, like a chart of accounts for public education. I think, Pat, that was something you brought to the table. Like, where do our recommendations fit in? Part of our job is to solve for X, so where do we begin? Does that sound?
Let me share this. The reason I ask for that as a resource to come to me as a subcommittee member is my interpretation of what I could do with this between now and the next meeting, where my mind started going, when I was reviewing this briefly before we got on today, and, during our conversation today, is I'm thinking, what could I take to my own organization's members? And, more broadly, could we do this in a forum where we could all share it and do the same thing, in terms of if I was going to put together a Survey Monkey and send it to my members and say, here are some categories of stuff that gets funded in education, from a business standpoint, would you say that this is a must-have, gotta have, a nice to have, or a whatever? I was just looking for, some starting place of, what are the things that I could test, in terms of just asking, business owners, how important is this? Is each one of these things? And I don't know how many of these there are, or, I'm sure that they can, I've used the number 16 and 64 just off the top of my head. I have no idea, but if I could get, I don't know, a dozen or 2 dozen, or I don't know how many, and pick the ones that are, to test, where I can just start to get some sense from regular business operators in industry members about, are they all saying that this is super important and this is super not important? Just to, that's what I was seeking, is something that could help me, construct something that I could rationally go out to my members, or, we could go out to our members and say, can you give us some input on this? But we can't go out there with a, 200 long list of stuff. We've got to give them something, a little tighter than 200 or whatever, in order to get any response at all. And you have to put something in front of them. You could ask them open-ended, and that will be also interesting. That would be an interesting approach too. What, unguided, what do you think are the most important things to fund in education? That would also be interesting. But I feel like you get more participation if you give them something to aim at and saying, what about this? Is it a 1, 2, or 3, or a 4? You know, that kind of stuff. Just trying to get to something actionable.
Okay. Okay, that provides some additional context. Thank you. The only thing that I captured that seemed like it doesn't feel like a formal recommendation at this point, because I didn't capture an awful lot around it. However, it may be as a team that you all really feel like it is at this point, which is fine. I'll have you help me kind of craft that. But it was primarily around equity in like which teachers are paid through funding. So I think Hope you brought up through funding, we don't even know which teachers, you know, these are actually fully funded, these are partially funded. Do you feel like that's a recommendation at this time, or that needs a more conversation?
I mean, for me, that's just whenever I'm out speaking to people or hearing, you know, different things. I have family that are in education, different ones, when they're like, oh, we want to know about this. So that's been something, and you know, district level and stuff that's been brought up. But again, I don't know from our subcommittee. I mean, I think thinking on the side of workforce development, seeing our teacher shortages, maybe, but I'm not sure for us if that's something that we need to. I mean, what do y'all think?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think, but I also think we can fold that in what Pat was saying, like getting better idea of these categories. I mean, don't just take it from Jared that I'm throwing out here 70% this, 50% that. I mean, I get it. Let's get it from the TDOE, what those expenditures are, and what categories they would like us to focus on. I'll tell y'all this, at the end of the day, up, down, sideways, everybody wants better, but very few people are for different. They all want better, but few people want different. Because different usually means a little uncomfortability for them somewhere, whether that's taxes or whatever.
So the last thing I'll say before we wrap is, if that feels like it requires some more conversation, I will not put that in a formal recommendation at this point. It can be part of something that comes up in next meeting, or possibly even subsequent ones after that. Last but not least would be something I captured, particularly Ralph. It's something that you mentioned, that folks out in industry, they know exactly what they want. They know the outcome of schooling, but they really don't have a clue what happens, how it actually occurs, how it's delivered, and how it's funded. Okay. All righty. So any last thoughts or additions you want me to make?
I'll just say I apologize. I literally told Jamie this will be a 5-minute meeting. We'll set, but I honestly think we got some good stuff covered here that might not have gotten covered if we'd had the full committee. But I think the full committee will be thankful we got some of these parameters established and questions answered for them ahead of time. So. And I will also say, Jamie said, well, if you don't go full meeting today, you can tack it on to the next meeting. That was her recommendation. I was like, good Lord, Jamie, are you trying to get me virtually shot by people? Come on up now.
I told him it was, as chair, he got to decide if he wanted to open that up for discussion to extend meetings. You know, if you needed to, if you feel like you need to go over, then you know, that's definitely a decision that can be made.
I do appreciate y'all bearing with me and staying over today.
Yes, absolutely. So I have pulled up the slide for the next meeting. It is December 6th. 12 Central, 1 Eastern. We do have an invite. Hopefully it's already made it to you. I sent all 5 out at one time, so most people just accepted all 5. So you can see the topic is categorizing and costing. That's the feedback you'll receive. By then you'll be receiving it on your off week. So we have a couple of off weeks. So just be on the lookout in your inbox to receive a little bit of note from me. There is a Google Drive that was in your invitation link today. So there's a big Google Drive that houses all the materials, and they have not all been loaded at this point. So just hang loose, they'll get there. Then there is another Google Drive. The second link down is the one for this specific meeting. So I have gone ahead and put today's presentation in there. And I will also put in the agenda after we wrap that does have the list of those who attended and those who were not in attendance today. So any final thoughts, or Jared, I'll hand it over to you to close us out.
No, just thank y'all for hanging with us. That's it. Don't want to keep y'all any longer, but appreciate y'all's commitment to this process.
Pat, thanks for accepting the nomination.
Thanks.